Alrighty, can you hear me? Yep. Excellent. So, right. So, when employing students and graduates for the first time, picking an appropriate starting salary can be pretty difficult, but it's also very important. Starting salary decides your bargaining position for future pay, determines what home loans you're eligible for, it determines how much disposable income you have. So, it's my position in this debate that the most appropriate metric for deciding the starting pay rate of students and graduates is their grades. I imagine there's probably two groups here. For those who don't have a degree, probably their high school standardized test results will be the best measure. In Australia, that's known as the ATAR. For university graduates, it will be their weighted average mark across their the course of their degree. In Australia, we have this as well. It's called your WAM. I do not support using things like what school they went to or an interview process or past job experience or references. It should just be about their marks, which is why I'm the affirmative on this topic. One last thing in setup. Obviously, not all jobs have mixed starting salaries and not all students complete their education. This degree is kind of narrowed by the fact that we are only talking about students who have marks which can be graded, and also jobs which have mixed starting salaries. So it's probably most likely about university graduates, most likely about jobs such as law firms, marketing firms, consultants, any job which has a potential for a mixed starting salary. So I'm going to prove three things. Compared to the alternatives, I think that students' grades are one, the most accurate, two, the most fair, and three, going to provide the best incentives. So with my remaining time in this opening thing, I'm going to talk about why they're most accurate. So when you get a degree in your field, your marks will likely reflect your knowledge in that field. So for example, if you're doing a degree in engineering, how well you marked, will show, for example, how much you've studied. It will show how much of the test you're able to complete and complete successfully. It will show your ability to process the sort of problems which you are likely to encounter in your job day to day. And those with higher marks are going to be able to do it better. So it seems that they are worthy of the job to begin with, but also worthy of higher pay in that job, since they are likely to be more productive. They are likely to make less mistakes. They are likely to have to be taught less things on the job because they have already demonstrated that they have learned them in the course of the degree. Also, if it is true that the degree is only, for example, tangentially related to the field, so for example, some degrees are quite general, it still shows more accurately than like a job interview, for example, because it shows your capacity to learn new things. It also shows your work ethic, right? Because if you've got a lot of high marks in your classes, it shows that you've put in a lot of effort. You are able to take a lot of personal responsibility and work well as an individual. So that is another reason as to why it accurately shows how good you are going to be at your job. If you compare it to things like an interview process, you can deceive interviewers, right? You can be quite well spoken, but you can actually not know all that much, casually known as bullshitting. Or the opposite, you could actually know quite a lot, but you could not be able to speak very well about it. And past work experience often just refers to family connections.
All right, so I think there's a little bit of misunderstanding with the topic. The topic says students should be paid based on their grades. And in the United States, the big debate here is while you're actually in high school or while you're actually in school, the United States has had this debate on whether you should be offered incentives. So the debate's actually not discussing like when you go to work, salaries should be based off grades. It's students should be paid based on their grades while they're in school. So the three main points of contention that I had that I think is different than what you were expecting is a payment system would further entrench economic division within school itself. We would make the education system worse because we would be focused on grades, which get incentives, and then rewards work in the short term, but they destroy achievement in the long term. So I didn't think the debate was going to be based off when you go to work, that this is what you're going to base it off. I thought it was that incentives in school, which is mainly what, if you're to like Google students should be paid based on their grades, there's a lot of New York Times articles and Wall Street Journal talking about incentives while you're still in school. For like, let's say you get an A in a math class, the school would give you $40, and that's going to help the students who are less achieving to hopefully motivate them to work harder. But I think we have two completely different debates right now, and I don't know if it's going to really work because I had prepared for something completely different, like while you're in high school or while you're in middle school getting this payment, not your salaries being based off your grades. So I'm going to pass the mic just so we can clarify this.
All right. Well, this isn't uncommon, to be honest, and sometimes debates, particularly when it's worded and we're from different contexts, will have different interpretations. What I will do is I will simply do an even if argument, which is to say that I will continue to push why in the context I'm advocating for this is a good idea. But I will also say, even if your definition is all right, I'd still advocate for what you're advocating against. And I would encourage you to do the same. So very quickly, I'd like to point out that many of my arguments about fairness and incentives actually work in both contexts, right? So when I'm talking about that grades accurately reflect your capacity to work, that is also a justification to pay it. It is also a justification to incentivize it, right? Because, regardless of whether the incentive is what you do in your job or what you're getting paid in school, the argument plays out exactly the same. Same based on fairness. So I guess I'll have your initial volley as to perhaps why you think my idea is bad and why you think the idea which you thought I was going to come with is bad, and I'll just engage with both.
All right, so I think that'll work. So then I think that there's some similarities between the two. So I guess I'll start with my first contention, and that's a payment system would entrench social and economic division. So if you were to look at it in high schools and middle schools, the thing is richer students have more access to resources, they have more time to devote to school, and as a result, they have more opportunity to get a better grade in the class. So the reason why this isn't fair, if we were to implement it in middle school and high schools, is you would see that students who work hard, let's say you're a poorer student, you need to devote a lot more time to school, you don't have the same resources, and you earn a C, and now because of this cash payment system, you're motivated to earn a B, you're still going to be getting less of a incentive or reward than a richer student who just had the resources and is going to get an A. And so this was actually studied by Stanford Professor Dr. Deci, who said that what makes this problematic is when they go home with a smaller payout while seeing other students receive checks of $500 or more, they feel unfairly punished and even less excited to go to school. There are suggestions of students making in the thousands of dollars, and the stress of that for kids from homes with no money is frankly unconscionable. And so if we were to apply this with, I guess, what you're saying about starting salaries, it would be the same concept. If I'm a poorer student who doesn't have the same access to resources and my salary is strictly based off my grades, it's going to be unfair to me because I don't have the same opportunities as the others who obviously have more time and more opportunity to commit themselves to earning the A. And so that's why the holistic system of determining a salary is so much more effective than rather strictly basing it off grades. Because grades don't look at the whole picture of the student. They don't look at the capabilities of the student. They look at strictly what you're able to do in the classroom. And so Howard Gardner actually has come out with the theory of multiple intelligences, which is becoming more and more common in companies such as Google, Microsoft, Facebook, where they're not just looking at how smart you are on paper. They're looking at how you demonstrate yourself in the interview, how you demonstrate yourself outside of just the transcript, because those are the people that go on to innovate, and those are the people who actually end up making larger salaries than someone who just had good grades and gets hired. So in both contexts, it's unfair because it's an economic division. If I'm a poorer student, I'm going to have a lower salary because my grades are going to be less, and there's no real argument on that. I mean, like poorer students on average just have less grades. And so we're prohibiting them from reaching what they can be in both school, and if we offer the incentives, then it gets worse for them. And then if we were to go with your system, when they go to work, they still get cheated again because now they're only being based off their grades. So a holistic system when determining salaries is clearly the more successful way to go about this.
Okay, so I think the first problem with your argument is that you're presuming that there's some sort of penalty for not doing well. But in fact, this is strictly a reward. So let's have a think about this for a moment. If your complaint is that rich and poor students are currently divided, they're already divided. So you need to prove to me that there is some sort of tipping point between the current point of division and the future point of division, which suddenly becomes very problematic. I think what is actually way more likely to happen is that there are some poor students who do well, and there are some who are talented. And particularly when you were young and when you were in school, that is the point where the entrenchment has the least effect on your life. Because once you've already passed in the workforce, you've already got your school and your work experience and everything, and the internship your dad gave to you. That's where those divides become much wider. At school, there is the potential for poor students to do well. Now, why is it that in the worst case, which is your worst case, when the poor students do worse than the rich students, so they get paid less, it's still a benefit because it's still more money than they had. And I would also point out that the gap in the impact of that small amount of money on a poor student will do way more for them than the amount of money you would give to the richest student, right? Because the richest students already got all of the things money can buy. They've got their tutors, as you said, they've got all the time off, they don't have to work. But for the poor student, that could be the difference between them having to work or not. That could be the difference between hiring a tutor or not, which means that actually, even if that money starts small, because the impact of it is so high for that person, it will lead to these sorts of things which correct for that inequality. Like you were concerned about, for example, they can't afford tutors. Maybe now they can afford to hire one, and then the effect of hiring the tutor is that they do better, and then they can get more money in the future. So even if it's unequal, it is still fine. Second thing, you're saying it's been studied, but you also said in your introduction that it hasn't been implemented yet. So I don't understand how a study can study something which has not yet been implemented yet. But furthermore, the ethic of your study is also a case against all grades itself, because the study you cited said when the kids go home with things unequal, they get demoralized. That is a case against all grading systems. And at some point, you've got to realize that even if some people are initially demoralized, the positive impact in the long term of the system will be more beneficial. The last thing I'm going to address is the thing which affects both of our points about multiple intelligences. Like theories of multiple intelligences, I think often reward the wrong things. It is fine to say, listen, some people are just very talented and maybe verbal intelligence is fine, but I do not think that is the right incentive you should put on people who work, because it often privileges things like accents. It privileges things like where you came from as opposed to how intelligent you are. What we should be rewarding in the workplace and what we should be rewarding in school is work ethic. And that is how much time are you willing to put in, how much time are you willing to study. And regardless of whether that's the salary you get in your job or whether it's grades you get at school, that is what should be rewarded, instead of like multiple intelligences, which is really just like a proxy for, do you speak in a posh enough accent? Have you done debating as a kid as an extracurricular? Did you have time for that? And I'll pass back to you.
All right, so the first thing I'll address is the fact that you're saying when you go home with a worse grade, there's already a division that exists. But what I show the clear link, and what's specific in the debate today, is the Stanford study from Dr. Deci, who said specifically when you see that student go home with a larger reward, when it means more to you, because the poor student is obviously seeing someone else who doesn't need the money as much as them go home with a larger sum, that's when the discouragement happens. And that happens specifically in the world of strictly financial incentives. Now, I don't think I said that it's never been implemented before. I said that it's been implemented strictly through private programs across the country in the United States, and this is data summarized by that. So with that, I actually want to bring up a point, is the fact that this is something that can't be implemented on a national scale because it would never receive public funding. The government would never be able to give taxpayer money to offer financial incentives. So it would only happen at a private level, and there's simply not enough financial donors or philanthropists who believe that this is a successful system. So because it strictly works on donations, there isn't enough money for this to actually be implemented on a larger scale. So I'm going to move on to my next contention, is that these rewards work in the short term, but they destroy achievement in the long term. So Alfie Cohen, the author of a book called Punished by Rewards, explains that when it comes to creative work, research shows that money doesn't work. In fact, it deters achievement in the long run. Moreover, any kind of extrinsic reward can be dangerous. In a well-known Stanford University experiment, researchers divided preschoolers into two groups, one that would get gold stars for their drawings and one that would not. When they were asked to draw again, the people who didn't receive the reward the second time cut their drawing time in half. And this has been extrapolated in a more significant study at a high school level with Harvard economics Ronald Fryer, who ran a $6.3 million experiment with 18,000 students in Chicago who were paid for good grades, and achievement across the board didn't budge. What he simply theorized is saying that paying kids for good grades or test scores doesn't actually give them more skills. He says the system needs to be more complicated and more specific to the needs of children to actually be effective. And now to go on this idea about when you're being hired, you're saying that salary should be determined strictly by the amount of time you're doing. And I'm not saying that the Howard Gardner multiple theory of intelligences is how we're going to do this. I'm saying that a holistic review, which we do right now, is far more effective than strictly basing it off grades. Because I don't believe there's any company right now that looks at your grades and determines your salary. They're going to look at the whole picture of what you did in college, what your achievements were, and with that, they're going to hire students. And there isn't any company that operates on this basis. So what you're seeing is that in high school and middle school, you can't use these rewards. They deter long-term achievement. But even if you're going to go off the basis that it's strictly for hiring professionals, a holistic review is more effective in college, and it's obviously more effective with companies as well.
Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is your it's been studied stuff. Okay, the first thing you haven't addressed is that you can just say, oh, it's specific to money, but you haven't proved why it's specific to money, which is the case with lots of things, by the way. There are studies out there which say that climate change does not exist, and there are studies out there which says it do exist. So multiple studies, and teaching is what I study. There are multiple theories, and lots of people come out with different ideas. So, for example, Cantor and Carter will talk a lot about why rewards are good, but Glasser says it talks about why they're bad. And the reason which you cannot point to a single experiment, which, as you said, has been restricted to one case in a privately run thing, that is completely disanalogous to the sort of thing which would be implemented if it was in this debate, right? Which would be a holistic government thing, which would have more checks and reviews. So you cannot point to one study and extrapolate from that without even presenting the logic of the study, why it is that kids get demoralized and why it is that wouldn't also be a case against all grades. Second thing I'm going to address is there's not enough money point. This is possibly the lamest debating argument ever, and also just a case against all ideas in debating. Everything costs money. The purpose of this debate is to presume whether it's a good idea or not. If I prove it's a good idea, then it's worth the money it costs. If you prove it's a bad idea, then it's not. The government can get money from places. We waste plenty of money on lots of things all of the time. Everyone has something they had the government spending money on. We'll take the money away from that and put it towards the good idea. The next thing you said was that talked about studies about intrinsic rewards reducing long-term achievement. The thing is that the studies which again you're talking about aren't like they're not reflective, because by your own admission they're constricted in their scope, and then they're not presumably longitudinal. There are lots of intrinsic rewards. There are some intrinsic rewards which work, right? Like anyone who's taught in a classroom can tell you that sometimes when you just give kids rewards, they do things more and more. And there are plenty of studies, Cantor and Carter, for example, which would support that review. I am the first to admit, by the way, that this, of course, can be taken way out of proportion. That maybe if all you give ever is intrinsic rewards to the exclusion of all other rewards, then they won't do it. But you'll find that if you couple them together, for example, if it's not a science experiment where the only variable is the reward, and you also give them positive reinforcement, you also give them achievement, then it works out for the better. What you have not addressed from my previous point was that the thing about money is if you give these kids money, they can spend it on the things which close the gap, like tutors, right? They can spend it on the things like textbooks which close the gap, which your initial problem, you were saying was the reason you didn't want to do this, was that rich kids could afford tutors and poor kids couldn't. When you give rich kids more money, it's not like there are more expensive tutors out there which are better, which will entrench the gap. But if you give the poor kids money, that is the difference between tutoring or not tutoring at all. That is the difference between having to work a job or not having to work a job. And that is why the money, even if there's less of it, is higher impact for the people who need it more. And that's what you haven't addressed. The thing about holistic review, look, it's just a euphemism. What you did in college is basically how much money your parents could spend on the extracurricular or how much internships your dad could get you in his law firm. Okay, that's why that is bad, and you ought to.
All right, so let's start with specific arguments. You first keep saying that I don't have any link to showing why it's specific to money. I said this twice already. I'll say it one more time. The reason why the specific students get discouraged because of the financials is because the poorest students see richer students walking away with money, and money means so much more to them because they know how much of an impact it can make on their household. So the reason why this specifically links to money and financial incentives is because the poorer students see the richer students walking away with the money, and the Stanford study specifically cites that that's the reason they get discouraged. Now, the next reason that you said the lamest argument in debate is that the money can just come from anywhere. I'm not going to tell you that we're never going to find money. I'm saying that even if the government implemented this program, there wouldn't be enough money to make the significant impact that you're so claiming. Right? There's not going to be enough financial incentives for me to suddenly quit my job because I'm getting an A in math and I get a financial incentive. I'm telling you that even if this program was implemented and you somehow found the money in the government, there wouldn't be enough of a difference to actually change the livelihood of the students. So instead, you're just dangling a $40 reward that isn't going to change the way the poor students perform in the classroom anyway. So then we're going to go to the next argument, which essentially is going to show you why the educational system as a whole would get worse. What Kentucky Educational Excellence Scholarship finds is that when they actually implemented the system, they saw that parents became in a lot more conflict with teachers because now all they cared about was grades and not their children's learning. All they wanted was teachers to move that B to an A or a C to a B so they could get more money at home. And what they theorized is that because of this system, the educational system would be destroyed because now all we care about is what we see on the transcript and not what we see our children coming home with. But more importantly, at Cornell, when they actually tried this system, they saw that students significantly decreased the difficulty of the classes that they were taking so that they could get a higher GPA with easier classes and destroy the learning system. And I'm not just going to keep throwing cases for you to just say that they're discredited. Mind you that you haven't mentioned any example in the debate today or any specific evidence. But if you don't want to even look at the United States, let's look at Dubai, who's implemented the system for 10 years. In Dubai, they said the same thing that Cornell's done. The average GPA increased by 0.2 because students decided to take all their classes in groups so that they could work together, cheat on their homework, and make sure that they got the A. What I tell you is that the educational system gets destroyed if we allow students to simply work together to take easier classes, and when parents start fighting with teachers because all they care about what's on the transcript. But more importantly, the reason why I'm going to tell you that in the job space, the holistic review is not who got more internships. It's because the interview is as important as what's on a transcript. When you go for that interview, they don't care what's on your resume. They care about how you communicate with them. And that's what they're basing their salary off. So for you to tell me that it's based off internships is simply false, because there are thousands of companies who want to see you as a person.
Okay, so the first big problem with a lot of your case studies is that they're straw men. They presume that I am going to implement the same sort of policy with the same mistakes, which has been replicated in your studies. But here are a few easy ways we can fix a lot of your problems. The first thing you said was that one of your studies was when the poor students saw, like in with their eyes, richer students going home with the money. Well, that's easy. Just pay it home to a bank account so that no one sees anything. They still see them, by the way, going with grades, and that could also cause the demoralizing. So there's easy ways you can fix that. The second thing you were saying as well, there's decreased difficulty of classes. As I said in my setup, make it a standardized test which schools can't interfere with. So make it based off things like in Australia we have the NAPLAN, so that the government is the one setting the test. Like and then another thing you were talking about with the can't afford it is that, oh, it's only $40, it's not going to make much of a difference. Okay, make it more than $40. Make it the amount it would be able to, so you could hire a tutor for a semester or buy some textbooks. All of the problems with your arguments are when people set up silly little straw men, and say, well, what if we did this idea super badly? Then the results would be bad. Well, no shit, right? Sometimes if you do the policy badly, it will go badly. What I'm suggesting is doing it well, and you can do it well by making the payments hidden from the other students. You can do it well by making the payments significant, and you can do it well. But you can do it well by doing it in a standardized test, which isn't subject to the sorts of things you were talking about. But let's actually look at some of the incentives you did talk about, like in Dubai, which I'm curious, by the way, if it wasn't paying off in Dubai, I don't know why they're still doing it. Where the students instead group together and do their homework together. This is an excellent incentive. If we're talking about a system which is encouraging students to get together with their friends and do homework, that is exactly what you want an incentive system to do. You want an incentive system, and if you're at university, in my system where it's about going into a job, you would rather those uni students get together and work on their grades together to make them better, rather than going and having a piss up at the pub. It's the sort of system which incentivizes people to work. And you could maybe argue with me that, listen, they're not learning as much as if they just did it themselves. That's not the comparative, because when there is no system, they're not doing anything for themselves. Because the grades don't matter. In my system, yes, it's not perfect. Yes, they're not going out to themselves, but you don't offer that either. At least if they're in a group, they are learning something. It's a group of friends who are doing homework instead of doing literally anything else, which will be not good for their education. Lastly, on interviews, look, when you talk to someone as a person, and I don't know if you've been to a job interview, they ask you things like, have you had any work experience? What sort of things do you do outside of school? Extracurriculars, for example. Those things are only gained by people who live in rich areas and who can afford to do them by your own characterization at the start, which is why they cause exactly the problem you were trying to solve, right? At the end of the day, grades are accessible to everyone. Everyone can study, and that.
All right, there were a lot of problems with the arguments you just brought up. First of all, it took you 13 minutes to get to the idea of let's use standardized tests. Now, if you said that earlier, I could give you a plethora of arguments as to why standardized tests are literally the worst way of measuring student achievement, and there's so many arguments to go off that. But because I don't have time to address standardized tests, I'm just going to simply say that standardized tests in the United States, the reason why they're on net going down, and the reason why globally we're using less standardized tests to compare country to country achievement is because they don't actually measure what you're learning in the classroom. They're just measuring how well you can fill out A, B, C, and D. But even more importantly, what you're saying is payments can become significant. I would still argue that just saying payments to become significant is not an actual argument. You can't just hope that there's going to be a lot of money for your system to implement. You actually have to show some kind of feasibility, how these private donations would happen, how the government would have enough money to fund some type of program to actually allow this to happen. But now let's go to the biggest concession in the debate today, which is where you essentially drop the initial argument you brought up about we're measuring salaries based off grades, because you say right now when there's no financial incentives, and I'm going to quote you, you say grades don't matter. But that becomes really problematic, because what you said in the beginning of the debate is we're going to base the entire salary of someone based off their grades. So when financial incentives don't happen right now, which is what you're essentially saying, you're saying that grades don't matter. But then the entire debate that you brought to me today was let's base salaries off grades. Well, I think that's really ridiculous if you're going to make the concession that grades don't matter. So I think on your end of basing salaries off grades, we can completely drop that debate. So we're left with the debate that I brought up to you, which is that incentives just don't work in high school and middle school. It doesn't work in any sort of system. Now, simply saying that my evidence is constrained or that my case studies are only looking for the bad shit, I'm telling you that's not what's happening at all. They've measured this because obviously educational professionals want to do what's best for students. They don't really care as to whether or not incentives are going to work or not. They've obviously tried them and there's been successes, but I tell you there's been a lot more failures, and until you give me a successful study, I don't know how we're going to compare the two. But I'm going to keep going with my examples of why this isn't working. Dr. Marinak of Penn State and Linda B. Gamble, a professional of education at Clemson University, published a study last year in the journal Literacy Research showing that rewarding third graders with so-called tokens like toys and candies diminished the time they spent on reading, because as soon as they realized they weren't going to get any more rewards, they didn't even want to return to reading at all. Why does the motivation seem to fall away? Researchers theorize that even at an early age, children can sense that someone is trying to control their behavior, and their reaction is to resist. Overall, what we've seen is that in Dubai, in the United States, in high school, in preschools, in elementary schools, all the studies show that we decrease long-term achievement and we decrease learning values. And for those reasons, incentives.
Okay, first thing, studies. Listen, there is controversy in this field. This is my degree. From Cantor and Carter to Bill Rogers to Glasser to the people you're talking about, there are lots of people with lots of studies and they all have different conclusions. You have given me no reason to believe that yours are the best and that ones in contradiction aren't. By that logic, everyone should simultaneously believe that climate change does and does not exist because there is a study to show so. Let's actually talk about the logic of how these things work. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the idea of standardized tests. You didn't talk about it earlier. But they're bad. Well, I did. I talked about the NAPLAN. You can refer back to the first video. But also, you're talking about standardized tests in the US, where they was outsourced to private companies, and the reason they're on the down and down is because it was part of George Bush's No Child Left Behind policy, blah, blah, blah. In Australia, they're on the up and up. We have the NAPLAN. We use them to track things like value added. You can do these things well. Using straw men of the worst examples of our countries have done this badly will not aid you in this debate. Secondly, you're talking about how the government have the money. Well, that is a case against the government investing in education ever. How will the government ever have the money to invest in our kids? It's an investment in the future. If I prove that it's a bad idea which lays down the right incentives, then it is the obligation of the government for the purpose of the debate to lay the money down somewhere. Otherwise, all negative teams would win always, because they could just say it was never affordable. At the end of the day, it's about the incentives. And it is not a contradiction for me to say, listen, grades don't matter now, because neither of these ideas have been implemented yet. I am saying that if, for example, the salary was based on grades, and if kids got rewarded for the grades, then the grades would matter. So the comparative is they don't matter now, but they will matter more if we implement either my or the idea which you were talking about. And that is why it would be a good idea to do it. At the end of the day, you've got to look at it from a comparative point of view. At the moment, poor kids don't have any other means to get extra money, and that money could be going towards tutors and books, and that would actually lead them to get better grades in the future. And the way which jobs are decided and the way which people's education is decided is largely that lottery of their family. This is a way for people who are talented but don't have the fortune of their family to get access to those things. It will not solve all inequality, but it will narrow it a little bit. It'll make it more meritocratic, and that is why it is a good idea.
All right, so in the last minute and a half, I'm going to give you several reasons why you can vote con in today's debate. First of all, the two debates got skewed in both aspects, but what Ben concedes is that grades don't matter right now, but he says if we implemented our system of basing salaries strictly off grades, then people are going to magically change their grades, they're going to change the entire educational system, and they're going to make sure that they have good grades. I tell you that's simply false. The system works, the system happens right now. There's not going to be a major difference if we shift. He said himself, grades don't matter. I tell you, it's ridiculous that you don't use holistic review, which happens in pretty much every company in the United States and global countries. You look at the person as a whole, not just what they see on the transcript. But now in the more specific debate, he tells you that, well, if we offer incentives, we're going to have a better system. What I tell you is the actual evidence and the actual statistics that tell you that it doesn't work. First of all, the concessions he makes is that, hey, in Dubai, they cheated on homework. That's great. He phrased it as, well, they're working together. I tell you in Dubai, the reason they stopped it is because they were directly cheating. He said standardized tests are the way to solve this problem. I tell you that standardized tests are one of the worst things that happen globally, not just the United States. But more importantly, he tells you that, well, we can have an unlimited source on the amount of money. I tell you that financial incentives aren't the best deal because unrefuted Stanford tells you that these financial incentives discourage poorer students when they see richer students walking away with more money. But what's even more effective is if you had this unlimited source of money that Ben so believes, I would say that let's use it on teacher training and smaller class sizes, which actually work in the educational system.